Hello and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Thorben. I hope you had a great day and grabbed your beverage of choice. For me, that's clearly a coffee. And that you have brought a few questions about JPA and Hibernate. Let me quickly check where the audio is coming from. Okay, that should be fixed now. So yeah, how are you? Hope that everything is going fine for you. Still not fixed. There it is. Okay. Finally. So I've prepared a few questions for today's stream, and then we can dive into your questions and see how I can help you with that. Okay, I already see there are several people in the US and other places joining the stream. That's great. William from the United States, Zuanu from Nigeria. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so let's start with the first question. Okay, here I posted an article about overriding primary key generation strategies. That's something that you need every now and then if you deploy your application in different environments. For example, with a Postgres or Oracle database at one client and a MySQL database as another client. So what you can then do is you define your default mapping in your entity annotations. And for MySQL in this case, which doesn't support sequences to generate primary key values, you override the generation strategy in your in an XML file. So what Hibernate does there is it takes the mapping defined on the entities and the mapping defined in the XML file and merges them. If you have two mappings for the same thing, then the mapping in the XML file wins. So we can use this approach to override only the primary key generation mapping for the ID attribute of the author entity and use identity. So what we would do is we would ship the application with this XML file to the client that uses MySQL, and everyone else gets the same application without that mapping file, and would then use the mapping defined in the annotations. So what's the question here? Nice. Would that also work for overriding the ID generation strategy defined in a mapped superclass? For example, overriding the ID's generated value to type identity. Well, that depends a little bit on what you want to do here. Sure, you could use that approach to override the mapping, but you would then override it. Now I get it. Yeah, of course. You can use that to override the mapping on the primary key mapping of the superclass. So the issue here is that you can't override the primary key generation strategy for the attribute on the superclass in any of its subclasses without overriding the primary key attribute. So providing another, defining the attribute again. That's just how Java works. But with the XML mapping, that should work fine. So let me quickly write an answer. Hi, Marcus. Yes, that should also work. To override the primary key generation strategy defined on the superclass. Okay. So I already saw that there were a few comments in the chat. So let's take a look at that right now. So I see people joining from India and Argentina. That's great. Some people on YouTube, others on Facebook. Today, for the first time, we're also streaming on LinkedIn. So if you're following me on LinkedIn, it would be great if you could check if you see the live stream there and give it a try. Live streaming on LinkedIn is still a beta feature. And just a few hours ago, I got the email telling me that I was accepted to the beta program. So yeah, let's give it a try. So Alexander asked on Facebook, hi, we have Spring Boot, Spring Inverse, Hibernate audit enabled. What may cause an issue like the following one? Where's the main issue? Object of class with identifier 97, optimistic locking fake, nested exception as well was updated or deleted by another transaction. Okay, Alexander, that is a typical error message for optimistic locking. So what happened there was you have two transactions running in parallel that updated the same database record. That could be there could be two requests from two different users. That could be two transactions that you start within your application. If, for example, you annotate a method with requires new, or if you have any asynchronous process running, stuff like that. So the optimistic log exception that you see there in the log is thrown whenever a concurrent modification on one database record occurs. I explained that in great detail in my advanced and also in the Hibernate performance tuning online course. This is a pretty common approach to avoid lost update issues. And the general idea there is that Hibernate manages a version attribute on the entity and a column on the database and increments it with each and every write operation, and then checks in the where clause if it still has the value that Hibernate read before. And if that's not the case, then Hibernate throws this this exception here. Yeldo asks, does Hibernate support named PL/SQL stored function queries annotation? I'm not aware of that annotation. What exactly do you want to do with it? Do you want to call it a stored procedure? If yes, then there's a named stored procedure, query annotation that you can use to define your query or the stored procedure call and then execute it. You can find an article about that on the blog. Grillix asks, you mentioned yesterday that the criteria API got deprecated in Hibernate. Question, what was the reason that the criteria API got deprecated in Hibernate? Is the reason that criteria API is not used or should not be used at all? Is the criteria API really used in real life? What could be an alternative to the criteria API if TypeSafe would like to be used? So the reason why it got deprecated is that right now there are two APIs and both are called the criteria API. There's one criteria API that is a proprietary Hibernate feature and has been used for ages. And then the JPA specification introduced its own criteria API, and Hibernate adapted it. Of course, it's a compliant JPA implementation. So the development team had to maintain both of these APIs, and they do almost the same. I mean, if you read the article that I published yesterday, you saw that, yes, they are different on an API level, but you can do the same with it. And because of that, the old Hibernate criteria API got deprecated in Hibernate 5. With Hibernate 6, that API will be removed. But on one hand, it doesn't make any sense to maintain two APIs. And then probably an important reason for that decision is that the Hibernate team decided to refactor the internal code that generates queries within Hibernate. So if they would keep their old criteria API, then they would need to update it to this new approach. So what they did was, in the past, they had multiple places in their code where they generated SQL statements, and now they introduced a semantic query model that is used everywhere in the code where you need to create a query, or where Hibernate needs to create a query, and then they use that semantic model to create an abstract syntax tree that then gets used to generate an SQL statement. So that streamlines a few things Hibernate internally, which makes it easier to maintain and to improve. So yeah, that's the reason why the old criteria API got removed. So short version, there were two criteria APIs, one defined by the JPA spec, which is the newer one defined by Hibernate, and the old Hibernate specific one gets removed with Hibernate 6, is deprecated in Hibernate 5. You can easily check which API you're using by opening the IDE and using any Hibernate 5 version. If the criteria API that you are using is deprecated, then it's the Hibernate specific one. But you wrote about using or ensuring type safety. That sounds like you're probably using JPA's criteria API together with the meta model. That is the JPA specific API, and that one is still supported and will be supported in the future. So it's pretty hard to get rid of any feature defined in the JPA spec. And as far as I know, there are no intentions to remove it. Hibernate will keep supporting it, and they will extend it in the future to add features that are currently not part of the specification, but they are that they think are useful. And then there was another question about it. You asked if it's used in real life. Yes, it's used quite often. I mean, there are always discussions about the criteria API as it's defined by the JPA spec. Some developers say, oh, it's amazing, it provides better type safety, it provides better support for refactorings and all these kinds of things. And the others say, well, it's so hard to read, I don't want to use it. And I understand both of them. Yes, the criteria API isn't that easy to read, but you get used to it. There are a few basic concepts that are applied everywhere, and that makes it really easy to get into it and to get familiar with it. As soon as you have got to that point, the type safety and the overall design of the API makes it really easy to write queries and to refactor them later on, because with the JPA meta model, you have no longer any magic strings in your query definition. Everything is defined via constant classes and attributes and stuff. And that is a huge improvement compared to Hibernate's old criteria API, and well, sometimes also compared to Jpqs statements. Okay, Grillix, I think I answered all the questions that you asked about the criteria API. If not, then please post them again in the chat. So Igor Reichert asked, a couple of days ago, you talked about ternary relationship. How would you avoid many-to-many relationship between another many-to-many? Well, avoiding these associations quite often isn't possible. I mean, if you design them in your domain model, then they probably exist in real life and you really need them. What you could do is you could transform them into two one-to-many associations. So what you would do is, instead of modeling a many-to-many association using Jpqs many-to-many annotation, map the association table that's used on the database level as an entity class, and then define two many-to-one associations from the two entities that are part of this many-to-many association to the association table. And yeah, that would avoid many-to-many associations in your mapping. You still have the many-to-many association on a database level and semantically, of course. Okay. Clayton said, hello guys. Yeah, welcome Clayton. Nice to have you here. Alreda asks, is there a way to paginate subrecords? Example, I have one too many thread to post. How can I fetch one thread and paginate the post entity list? The only way to do that is to use a Jpqs query or a criteria query. So if you have a too many association in your domain model and you want to only get a part of the elements in that list, then you can't handle that in your entity mapping. The only thing you can do there is you can create a query that fetches the association and then uses an order by clause and to make sure that the order is still the same or always the same, and then use the set first result and set max records methods on the query interface to set the pagination. William wrote on LinkedIn. Okay, nice. So it seems to be working there, but stream is a little laggy. William, I'm sorry for that. Right now I'm streaming to Restream, and they are distributing it to LinkedIn, and it's the first time that I'm streaming on LinkedIn. I will look further into that, but right now I've no clue if there's any way to improve that. Maybe a question to the people on YouTube: is the stream laggy today? So is it on my end or is it somewhere else? Based on the data that I see here, everything looks fine. Yeah, let's see. Okay, not laggy at all on YouTube. So maybe it's something on LinkedIn or in the integration to LinkedIn, and then we can just hope that it gets better in the future. But thanks for letting me know, William. As I said, I will look into that and maybe can provide a better experience next time. So Alreda provided a few more information about the question with the paginator too many association between thread and post. Current way, do a join and keep the thread being duplicated. This way I can set the record number I want, but I think it is hacky. Well, Alreda, to be honest, I've no clue what you're doing there right now. Is it a query that you are executing and on which you set the record number? That would explain the join. And if that's the case, then yes, that would be the preferred approach. And now it seems okay on LinkedIn. Thanks, Mohammed. Great to know. Let's see how the whole live streaming thing on LinkedIn develops. Then Spartan asked, Is it possible to skip creating snapshots in memory for dirty checking, but also keep level 1 caching? I've read this is possible, but with data session, but disable level 1 and also lazy fetch. Thank you. Yes, there is an option to avoid snapshotting if we are talking about the same thing here. So let me quickly explain how dirty checking works by default. So by default, whenever you fetch an entity, Hibernate creates 2 copies. One is handed to you and one is kept internally. Every time Hibernate now has to flush the persistence context, for example, because you commit the transaction or execute a query. Hibernate takes its internal copy and the copy that it handed over to you and checks all the attributes of these 2 objects. If any of them is different, then you changed something on the entity object, and that means the entity is dirty, which means Hibernate needs to generate an update statement to store the information or the changes in the database. You can now activate bytecode enhancement, which is something that I explain in my Hibernate performance tuning online training. And there you can tell Hibernate to use an enhanced or optimized version of the dirty check. And what Hibernate does there is Hibernate adds code to the setter methods of all attributes of your entity class at compile time. And because of that, Hibernate doesn't need these 2 copies of an object and doesn't need to compare them. Because Hibernate can track changes when you call the setter methods. And that avoids the additional snapshot in memory for the dirty check. It requires less memory, it's more efficient, it's a general recommendation for applications that work with lots of entities. Somber asks, I am getting to know with Envers. Is there any workaround to create audit reader query with too many traverse relations at Hibernate 5? Well, yes, you can create queries that use that traverse too many relationships with Hibernate, Envers in Hibernate 5, and I think it was also possible in Hibernate 4. But I don't think, no, I don't have an example here right now. But if you check the Hibernate Envers documentation, then you will find information about different ways to query your audit log. So if you look at a normal database without auditing, then you have basically a one-dimensional data model, right? You have tables and that are connected, then there are associations between then, and you can traverse these associations and perform complex queries. And you only store the current set of information in there. Auditing adds another layer, or better said, another dimension. Now, for each record, you also track the changes in time. So you have a 2-dimensional data structure. And what you now need to do is you need to execute a query that takes a horizontal perspective on the audit log, which means it takes one layer out of the log and then performs a query on that. And there you can also join over too many associations, and well, you can basically do everything that you do in other queries as well. It's pretty powerful. Yeldo asks, is there best practices to be followed while using name store procedure queries annotation? Well, I would say they're the same best practices you should follow as for any other named query. And that basically is use a constant as the name of the query so that it's easy to reference within your code. Introduce constants for parameter names. And well, maybe one name stored procedure query specific best practice would be to use the same name for the stored procedure on your database as and for the name stored procedure query that you define with that annotation. That makes it a lot easier to talk with your DBAs and to understand what's going on there. Okay. Oh, William, I just saw your messages. Thanks for checking LinkedIn. Really appreciate it. And well, it seemed to be an issue at the beginning of the stream. Let's hope for the best now. Okay, one last query question from the chat, and then we take another look at a blog comment. Then I think I answered all of them in the chat. Is there a way to insert a record in Hibernate efficiently? I have 60,000 records to insert, which is taking a lot of time. Well, first of all, if you're just inserting records, Hibernate or any other object relation and mapping framework is probably not a great fit for that use case, because the object-oriented representation creates an overhead. And if you're just inserting records, then you probably don't benefit from the interesting features that Hibernate or other object relation and mapping frameworks can provide, like modeling associations and being able to traverse them, the whole lifecycle model, and so on. So this might be a case where you only have an overhead by using Hibernate, but no benefit. Nevertheless, there are applications out there where it makes a lot of sense to use Hibernate as an object relation and mapping framework, and for some reason you decide, okay, there's this one import use case and I need to implement it. And you decide to implement it using Hibernate as part of that application. In that case, there are a few things you can do, not too many, but a few. First of all, you should make sure that you use generation type sequence to generate your primary key values if you're generating them and if your database supports sequences. That enables Hibernate to separate the generation of the primary key value from the actual insert statement. And that provides a few benefits along the way. The next thing you should do is you should make sure that you benefit from Hibernate's sequence strategy optimizations. If you define your sequence generator using generation type sequence, let me quickly check for an example. I'm pretty sure I have something here. Primary key, maybe here. Well, no, but we will use that one anyways. So what you can do here is you can set the strategy to sequence, and then you should reference a generator like author sequence. So if you're using Hibernate 5, then this is already good enough. Hibernate will generate a sequence generator with that name that then maps the database sequence and uses the default allocation size. What is the allocation size? The allocation size is something that you set on your sequence generator. Here, allocation size, and by default it's set to 50. When you're inserting 60,000 records, and if you're just using the entity for that case, use case, then you might decide to use a bigger allocation size. By default 50 is fine. So what Hibernate does here is Hibernate requests one value from the database, expects that the sequence increments itself by 50, and that enables Hibernate to increment the sequence value, or the primary key value that it got from the sequence, internally 49 times. For example, if Hibernate gets the value of 100, then it knows that the next value on the sequence is 150, and that means that Hibernate can internally count from 100 to 149 and doesn't need to request another value from the sequence. So that drastically reduces the number of select statements on that query and speeds up your insert job. The next thing you can do is you can activate Jdbc batching, which is another feature we talk about in the Hibernate Performance Tuning course. And there you tell Hibernate to not send one insert statement for each entity to the database, but to group them into batches and use the batching feature defined by the Jdbc spec. The general idea there is to send one statement with a two-dimensional array of values to the database, one record in that array for each execution of the insert statement. So that would reduce the number of database round trips performed for the insert statement from one for each entity to one for each batch. And that also speeds up the whole processing of the insert operations and enables the database to cache a few things it has to prepare for the insert. And then the third thing you should do is you should, after you did the steps that I explained before, then you should monitor, okay, at which point does the throughput of the insert job decrease. Most likely after a few thousand records, you will see that you started with a lot of records inserted per second, and then you starts dropping. That's quite often because of the overhead of the managing all these entity objects in the persistence context. And there it's a good idea to flush and clear the called the flush and clear methods on the entity manager to make sure that the persistence context doesn't build up to a point where managing all these entities, especially during flush operations, slows down the application. When you call the clear method, please always make sure to call a flush first. If you're calling the clear method, then Hibernate just clears the current persistence context and it doesn't check if there are, and that means that it removes managed entities from the persistence context, it detaches them and doesn't track any changes on these entities anymore. If you haven't updated, if you have persisted the record in your database, then you will just lose the insert operation, and that is, of course, something we would prefer to avoid. Yeah, these would be the three things I would recommend if you have to implement a mass insert operation. So use generation type sequence with Hibernate sequence generator optimization. Use Jdbc batching and flush and clear the persistence context at an interval that you need to test for your application. And all of these are only recommendations if you decided that either object relational mapping is a good approach for that use case, which I doubt, and or you are forced for some reason to use Hibernate. Okay, Emil asks, I have a hard time deciding when to use fetch type eager lazy in combination with Jpqs join and fetch join clauses. What are their most recommended usage scenarios? So my recommendation is to always use fetch type lazy. It almost never happens that fetch type eager is a good approach for all use cases of your application. But after you've set fetch type eager, Hibernate has to follow it. And you can't override it in your query. Fetch type lazy, on the other hand, is a hint. That means it's a suggestion on what your persistence provider should do. And you can override it using a join fetch clause in your query. And that enables you to define an entity mapping that has very few side effects, which basically means it doesn't fetch any data that you don't need. And then to define queries for each specific use case that fetch exactly the data that you need, which most likely for most use cases will be differently. So yeah, always use fetch type lazy, use join fetch clauses or fetch join clauses to initialize associations that you need for your current use case. That would be my recommendation there. Okay, lots of questions today in the chat. It's great. Let's take another look at the blog comments that I prepared for this stream. Okay, how to implement a custom sequence-based ID generator was the post. Okay, here I showed how to extend Hibernate sequence style generator and then add something like a prefix or a postfix to it, which are pretty common requirements. So yeah, here I show how you can implement that, and got a few questions about that. So Ankita asks, can I use this custom generator for a column which is not a primary key? Unfortunately not. JPA specification clearly defines that all these generator annotations and generated value annotations are supposed to be used with primary key values and only with primary key values. You of course can call the method provided by the generator programmatically, but that's obviously not what Ankita wants to do here. So let me quickly answer the question. Hi Ankita. No, you can only use these generators on primary key attributes. The JPA specification clearly states that you can only use these primary key attributes. I think, yeah, that's the same question again. So let's answer it here as well. So there was a third question. Oops, where is it? There's the third question by Mugen. Thank you for sharing the concept. Every time when I'm creating the new model class and using the custom sequence generator as you have shown us, let's see in the name book sequence. Here, whenever the table of book is created, it also automatically creates a table for book sequence, takes unnecessary space. No, Hibernate doesn't create a table, it creates a database sequence called book sequence. So Mugen Hibernate generates a database sequence called book. I use it in this example to generate or to provide the producer for unique numeric values. If you don't need it, if you don't need it, you should implement a generator that doesn't extend Hibernate sequence generators implementation. Okay. Any more questions from everyone here in the chat? So right now I only see the last question from Emil, which I answered a few minutes ago. If you have more questions, feel free to ask them. I'm happy to answer them. Steve, thanks for pointing out the question about the inserting 60,000 records. I answered them. Yeah, I answered them already with the recommendations to use database sequence and generation type sequence with the sequence generator annotation on your entity mappings to separate the insert operation from the primary key value generation, and to use the Hibernate's optimization that reduces the number of select statements on the database sequence, then to activate Jdbc batching for that use case, so that Hibernate uses the Jdbc feature batching that groups multiple identical statements into one batch and sends that batch as one statement with a bunch of values to the database. And the third one would be to monitor your test scenario and to identify at which point the size of the persistence context and managing all these entities in it becomes an overhead that slows down the application. Steve posted more about that. For this case, what if the record I wanted to insert is the join record? Let's say if the record user has relation with address record and other joined records. Steve, in that case, you should follow these same suggestions that I just made. What you should also do is you should activate Hibernate's order insert and order update properties, so set them to true in the persistence.xml file, which tells Hibernate to basically to order the insert statements, which ensures that there are multiple identical insert operations executed after each other, which then allows the Jdbc driver to group them into a batch. Besides that, it would be the same recommendations as I said before. You just need to instantiate the entity objects, model set the associations between them, and persist the entities. Hibernate takes care of everything else. Rita asks, is it normal to write a lot of queries, one query for each use case, when using Hibernate or any ORM in general? I just feel like it defeats the point of using an ORM. Well, that depends on the operation you want to perform. If you want to update data, then you could just fetch the entity by ID and maybe traverse a few associations. If you have a read operation that just needs a few information from different entities, then in general it's better to write a specific query for that just fetches the information that you need instead of a graph of entities. That just provides the better performance. If it's necessary, is a completely different question. That always depends on hardware resources, per number of requests, overall load on the application. Let's say if you're implementing an in-house application that's used by, let's say, 30 to 50 users, then you can avoid a lot of these things and just use a straightforward entity implementation with a minimal number of queries, because the hardware that we have nowadays just compensates for the inefficiency in your code. But if you have a web scale application with hundreds or thousands of requests in parallel, these things become important. Or if you perform operations on a huge data set, then yes, you need to provide a query for all the important read operations. One that is specifically designed for the use case and the information that you need there. Mehmet asks, hi, what is the best cases of the one-to-many implementations on Hibernate? Well, for one-to-many associations, you should use fetch type lazy. I always recommend to model it as a set because that enables you to use multiple join fetch clauses within one query. And yeah, that's basically it for one-to-many specific mappings. Then you have all the other general recommendations like as close to the table model as possible. Don't do any crazy stuff in equals to string hashcode implementations and things like that. Yeah, but in general, for one-to-many associations, there isn't a lot that you can do on or need to do on the Java side. Just use a set and fetch type lazy. And on the database, make sure that you have an index on the foreign key column. It's rarely a bad idea to have an index on these foreign key columns. Then another question from, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm pretty sure I would mispronounce your name. So let's just get to the question. Is second level caching recommended for frequently changing entities? No. Well, second level caching is recommended for if an entity gets read 9 to 10 times for each write operation. So as long as you get these 9 to 10 read operations on the entity, or better even more, then it doesn't matter how often your entity changes. It just has to be read more often. In general, if you're already pointing out that there are frequent changes on the entity, then you probably don't get this 9 or 10 to 1 ratio. Vinod asks, what is the use of use Jdbc metadata defaults property of Hibernate? To be honest, I don't know from the top of my head. I would need to check that as well. I would hope that it's described in the user manual. Right now, I have no clue. Another question from Alreda. How can I know what connection pooling settings to use? I'm currently using previous values since I'm on local, but how does one do it? Well, my recommendation there is always to discuss that with the DBAs in your team and in operations, because there are a lot of things that are playing into it. Sure, you could just increase the size of your connection pool, especially when you see that you're running out of connections in the pool in production. But I would be careful with that. I don't like the general recommendation to then just increase it, because a connection on the database side is an expensive thing. There are a lot of resources connected to a connection. And just ramping up the pool size might create side effects. And it's, well, if you increase it too much, then it definitely will create side effects. So that is something that you should discuss with your DBAs. If you're using an Oracle database, for example, there might also be some license limitations. So yeah, that's something that needs to be monitored and decided for the whole system. And it probably, well, in general, it differs for each and every deployment that you do. Sure, we have some, normally some numbers that match most of the customer systems, but in general, that's something that needs to be customized depending on the system on which you're running. Okay, let's pick another question here. Philip asks, why this code doesn't generate any out-of-sync primary key? Wait a second, what do we have? We have an entity, it gets mapped to the warehouses table. Then I commented out sequence generator. There's the real sequence generator. Sequence name, sequence warehouse ID sequence. Okay. So this is something you should always double check. If you find allocation size 1, then you're basically deactivating the optimization that I described a few minutes ago that prevents Hibernate from selecting each and every primary key value from the database sequence. So that slows down your application. Sometimes it's necessary because of other constraints in your system. And then we have an ID annotation, a generated value, sequence warehouse, that's the one up here. Okay. Any out-of-sync primary key, I should get default. Well, that's basically because that's not how Hibernate uses sequences. How was his name? Philippe. I mean, it doesn't use the sequence as a default value. It instead selects the sequence value before it inserts the primary key value. I explained that in more details here. Let me quickly check. I have a longer article in which I show how to map primary key values and use all these different generators. There, how to generate primary keys. Okay. That one's answered. Okay. Then let's take a quick look at this one here. I've read simple flow that saves the data using JP and Spring Boot application, but it takes 900 milliseconds in saving one transaction. That is not acceptable in my case. Can you please help? I would need more detailed information on which statements Hibernate executes. Any recommendations? Okay, and this one is an article about how to call native SQL queries with JP and Hibernate. I'm using create native query method with entity manager, left join, where clause in it. And facing is the below error. I got it. There is an error in your SQL statement. You should find more information at the end of your stack trace. That's a general thing for native queries. When you're executing a native query, you need to scroll to the end of your stack trace. There is usually the exception thrown by your Jdbc driver, which contains the actual information about the issue. Everything that you see above that is usually quite useless. Okay, so hi Aska, nice to meet you. Okay, so I'm answering Omkar's question from the chat, and as long as nobody else posts another question during that time in the chat, then I will end the stream there. Before I do that, I want to quickly announce next week's stream, where when Gerrit Meyer will join us. He's working on the Spring data integration for Neo4j. He's part of the Neo4j team. And I'm looking forward to talk with him about the new release of their Jdbc driver and everything that's of their Neo4j driver and the Spring data integration and everything that has been going on there. If I remember correctly, then this whole thing will be part of the next official Spring data release. They published a release candidate, and he will give us a few information about what's basically coming. And if you have any questions about Neo4j using graph databases or the Spring data integration, then you should definitely join. Or if you just want to see something that's a little bit different to the typical relational database stuff that we're usually talking about here. So, Omkar's question. I'm starting to work on a side project, but really confused whether to choose Spring Data JPA or Spring Data Jdbc. It seems both approaches have pros and cons. Your views on this? Omkar, that's an interesting question. So it depends on what you want to achieve with Spring Data and with the side project. If you just want to try new technologies and you're already familiar with Spring Data JPA, then I would recommend to take a look at Spring Data Jdbc. If you haven't used any of it and you want to prepare for a job interview or just do an evaluation for maybe for the next project at your job, then I would recommend to probably take a quick look at both of them. But Spring Data JPA is definitely the more popular and more established one. So yeah, so what's the difference between Spring Data JPA and Spring Data Jdbc? Spring Data JPA is basically a Spring integration for JPA. And it provides things like the typical Spring Data repositories. So it generates the required classes for a repository pattern. It provides a derived query feature where you just need to define a method name, and Spring Data generates the Jpqa query that gets executed. It takes care of most of the boilerplate code that's required when working with JPA. So this is a really nice thing if you're already using the Spring Stack and if you want to work with a relational database and with JPA. For example, with Hibernate as its implementation or with Eclipse Lake. Spring Data Jdbc takes a slightly different approach. Spring Data Jdbc is, well, Jens, the main developer of it, always says it takes a pretty opinionated approach to object relational mapping. So it's also an object relational mapping, but not with such a big feature set as JPA, which doesn't have to be an issue. And it puts domain-driven design in the main focus. So it supports you to implement it, your domain model based on aggregates and to read and navigate the whole your whole data set based on aggregate roots and the associations to the other entities within that aggregate. And you will need to write more SQL queries yourself there, or take more care of the database interaction as you would need to do with Spring Data JPA, which can be a good thing because it gives you more control over what you need to do. If you're already very familiar with JPA, know that its ins and outs and all its pitfalls, and you like this kind of approach, as I personally do, then Spring Data Jdbc might feel not as comfortable as Spring Data JPA, because with all this additional options that you have and control that you get over the Jdbc statement, how data is fetched and stuff like that, you also get more responsibilities and you need to write more code. Mark is there. Yeah, Mark Pallor is also a great person to ask about Spring Data Jdbc. And he just wrote, based on domain-driven design concepts, mostly aggregate, Spring Data Jdbc doesn't do several things that JPA does. By not having a session cache or object caching, it avoids some of the complexity that you would get with JPA. Yeah, that's a good point. So you don't have the caching on the persistence layer. You can, of course, cache on a business layer, which quite often is a better approach anyways. And you don't have lazy fetching of associations as you have with Spring Data JPA. With Spring Data JPA, you can fetch an entity and then lazily fetch associations. That doesn't fit in very well into the domain-driven design concept, where you always work on an aggregate. So Spring Data Jdbc fetches an aggregate, which is the aggregate root, for example, the order, with all the associated entities that belong to that aggregate, which would be order positions, for example, and maybe an invoice and delivery address or stuff like that. Okay, then let's take a look at Francisco's question, and then let's end this the stream already running for about an hour. So he asked, what if you put in the attribute ID when you make HQA query failed, so need to rename the column with I'm not sure if I understand Francisco's question correctly. To me, I don't know what is wrong. Select holder from holder entity, holder join holder to policy entities, MP policy ID. Policy ID. So Francisco, well, in general, I don't see any reason why you would need to rename the column. So you can use ID columns or ID attributes on your entities without any issue. The two things you need to make sure is that if you the two things you need to make sure is that if you reference the ID column in the where clause and you joined multiple entities, then you need to start the reference with the alias of the entity followed by a dot, the path operator, and then the name of the column, which would be ID. And if you use it as a bind parameter value, then there's only allowed to be one named bind parameter with that value, and that can also be ID. I've used that several times in my projects. Usually, the name of the entity column is just ID of the primary key. That's a pretty common thing. So, yeah, if you're still struggling with that issue, then please either post a comment here on YouTube or maybe on Stack Overflow. And if you post it on Stack Overflow, then send me a link to it. and provide more code in addition to the query, and then I will take a closer look at that. Okay, then that's it for today. Thanks a lot for joining, and all the questions that you guys asked in the chat was really great. I hope to see you again next week. As I said, Garrett Meyer will join us from the Neo4j team. Neo4j is a pretty popular graph database, and we will talk about all the new things in the upcoming Spring Data release for Neo4j. Okay, have a great rest of the day, and see you again next week or tomorrow on YouTube with a new video. And please take a look at it. I changed up the format a little bit, made a few things different to the usual videos. It would really be great to get your feedback on that. If you're already subscribed to the YouTube channel, then you will get a notification for it. And if you are on my mailing list, then I will, of course, also send out an email for the video. Okay. Take care. Have a great day. Bye.